Good. We're going to start now, as we need to shorten this a little bit, probably by 20 after 1 today. So, welcome. We're at the second in the semester series of World Affairs Luncheons. Although I've seen many of you at George Mitchell. A lot of you? Yeah. It's attempting to abide by my belief in the sanctity of the short introduction. I confess that I'm having some trouble with that today. Professor Hochschild has posed fascinatingly unsettling question. Genomic science, politics, and race, can they coexist comfortably? It would be hard to imagine a more challenging topic, and one that is relevant to our future, indeed to our identity, to our culture. The professor is the Henry LeVar Jean Professor of Government and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She studies and teaches about the intersection of American politics and political philosophy, particularly in the areas of race, ethnicity, and immigration, as well as educational and social welfare policies. She's a scholar with a powerful civic commitment, as is evidenced in her concern for public schools, public culture, and public policy in our country. I will not continue with the description of who she is and what she is thinking about. It's much more important to have her enlighten us on the challenges and the promise of new research, the new possibilities, the new probabilities that are posed in our society and have something to do with our destiny. So please help me welcome to the podium Professor Hochschild.
Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here to talk about this. I want to first, of course, thank the Schemel Forum and Sandra Myers for inviting me, for putting this together, for bringing you all here. This is a project that I've been working on for some years. I think I and my co-author here, Maya Sen, are maybe the only political scientist, I can maybe think of one other, who's actually studying this stuff. So I'm very much interested in what other people have to say because my own discipline isn't talking about it very much. So a couple very general introductory comments. I am a political scientist, not a real scientist, so this is much more about kind of the politics and ideology around genomic science. The real scientists in the room may well wince at some of either what I say or what my subjects are saying, but I want to sort of distance myself a little bit from the real biology. This is about, again, politics, ideology, social uses, public policy around this very new and very exciting and very important piece of science. The other thing I will simply say is that this is a genuinely co-authored project, so if I say we, it's not a royal we, it's a genuine we. So I apologize for this long and dense title. I think the title that Sandra gave you was a much better one, which is essentially Politics, Genomics, and Race, Can They Coexist? And that's really what we're trying to do. I will talk my way through these various terms, but the big question is the intersection between genomic science, at least as popularly understood, perhaps not as performed in a laboratory or a medical office, race, again, as popularly understood, not as a scientific term, but as a kind of conventional social usage, political partisanship, political parties, and how these all do or don't come together effectively or disastrously in the United States. So that's my topic. So I want to start with just the question of whether there is, in fact, a politics around genomic science. And of course, my view is that there is, or there will be, or it will evolve in some fashion or other. But how and what? So I start with just a couple of very general analogies that might be the ways in which people come to think about genomics. As somebody was saying this morning at breakfast, there isn't really anything new under the sun, so people will start thinking about this new science in a way that they have thought about old issues, perhaps, question mark. So there's at least 2 or 3 sets of analogies that I just want to kind of get us warmed up by talking about. One has to do with the use of genomic science in the criminal justice system. The Innocence Project uses DNA testing to focus on exoneration of people who have been falsely convicted. These are disproportionately young, or earlier, they were young when convicted, black men, poor, with probably lousy lawyering, who have typically been convicted of rape and murder. About 300, a little more than that, have been exonerated through the use of DNA testing. So it's a liberal exoneration, racial justice enterprise. The other way, another analogy for genomics in the criminal justice system is the phrase of sort of Jim Crow surveillance. There are now over 10 million DNA samples in the federal FBI database. These are also, you won't be surprised to hear, disproportionately young black men convicted of fairly serious felonies who typically have been caught up, correctly or not, and of course we don't know whether it's correct or not because these are suspect. There's lots to be said about the criminal justice system, but the basic point here is that one version of what's going on there is that this is just simply a new form of Jim Crow. This is a form of sort of federal or scientific surveillance of the black male population. So Innocence Project is about exoneration. Jim Crow surveillance is about inappropriate or excessive conviction, or at least surveillance. A second kind of analogy is about the science itself. Banging down the doors to the lab, it came from a talk that Mary Claire King gave at Harvard when I was just starting to work on this project, and she was simply describing the enormous excitement of the postdocs in her lab, that at 7 a.m. they can't wait to get into the building because they want to see what happened last night, or they want to do something new, or they want to continue what they've been doing forever, which is mostly what postdocs do as far as I can tell. But the scientific excitement around this project, science is marching forward, this is something genuinely new. It both will continue and it should continue, and on balance it's a good thing. The other phrase, the genome huggers, comes from an interview that I did with someone who says that genomics is really quite scary, it's quite dangerous. Her analogy, of course, is to tree huggers, right? Kind of environmental protection. She's not particularly enthused about the idea of genome huggers, but the idea is that genomics is a genuinely, sufficiently novel intervention in the meaning of of being human, that we need to be much more cautious and thoughtful, deliberative about the ethics, the philosophy, as well as the science. So science is marching ahead, or science needs to be controlled and worried about a little bit more. That's kind of the point of that second analogy. The third one is the one that's actually relevant for talk today, and it comes out of the arena of DNA ancestry testing, which I'm only going to briefly refer to here. But the basic idea is that DNA testing will show that people are literally as well as metaphorically mixed, that we all stem from, of course, an initial founder population in Africa, and that what genomics will show is that there is no such thing as race. It's a purely social convention. We are all in important ways mixed, and so this is going to dissolve conventional racial hierarchies and conventional understandings of race. The flip side of this, the reverse analogy, is that genomics is, again, you see in this quote also comes from one of my early interviews, that the long tail of genomics is eugenics, that the genomicists don't think they're engaging in genetics, they know that, in eugenics, they know that science or that history, that's not what they're about, but that's how it will be used, or in the deeper sense that sociology of science people will say, that's implicit in the nature of doing genomic science, given that we can't get away from racial or ethnic or categories. So that's kind of that frames the issue for today's talk. So there's big politics going on, at least underneath or behind or around the side of genomic science. I will report from my own experience, and probably from what you know, that elected officials don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. They have no idea how to think about it. So this is not politics in the electoral arena. You don't see presidential candidates taking positions on genomic science. You might someday in the future, but not now. Okay, the flip side of all of this introduction is that there aren't any politics in here. And this comes from an interview with a very high-ranking federal official who is himself a genomicist and has been working both in the labs and in the government for years. And I'm a pretty good interviewer. I've done a lot of these interviews, and this interview fell flat. I just could not get this man to talk, and I kept worrying that there was something wrong with me, or that he had an assistant in the room, and maybe that was sort of curtailing the conversation. And going back and looking at the transcript later, I think we were just on two different planes. I was trying to get him to talk about the politics and ideology behind genomic science, and his answer was, there are ethical, legal, social issues, but no partisan dynamics. I don't have partisan conversations. My assistant has to remind me if the member of Congress that I'm going to talk to is a Democrat or Republican. This is about science. This is not about politics. Well, as a political scientist, of course, I don't buy that. But that's a very important perspective that to keep in mind and to kind of think about as we go through. And in fact, it turns out to be more true by the end of this talk than I would have thought at the beginning. That's a little hint of where I'm going. Okay, so how do we, my co-author Maya San and I, think about organizing a discussion of the politics and ideology around genomics in these various arenas: criminal justice arena, racial arena, medical arena, scientific arena. We have two dimensions, one which runs from technology optimism to technology pessimism. I'm going to explain each of these and how they work together in a minute. I just want to kind of lay out the very general background. The second is what we call a dimension ranging from, or continuum from genetic penetrance or genetic determinism or genetic fundamentalism. There's a variety of ways, none of which is quite right here, to something that we're calling environmental determinism. Again, that one's complicated because, as you can see from the ASCO, this is a whole lot of things that might be the opposite of genetic penetrance. We're ignoring all those other things, focusing only on environmental determinism as its opposite for today. But we may want to come back to that, and we may want to pursue that. Both usually have an ideological or partisan valence. I'll talk about that in a minute. So, but let me describe my terms first a little bit. And again, sort of the first paragraph on the screen comes typically from an interview, and the second is my very quick gloss on it. Race is a terrible proxy for health. Genetic variation is within people of African descent more than across the population of the world as a whole. But in the absence of biomarkers, if race is the best proxy, use it. To save a life, who gives a shit about social context? Pardon my language, this is a direct quote. So the idea is that genetics, we get it that there is no such thing as black, white, certainly Latino, Asian, Native American, but I'm a doctor and there are probabilities and I'm faced with a patient and I'm going to use whatever tools I can. And you're going to tell me not to, right? So that's this position. Slightly more formal way of putting it is that important human phenotypes are caused or importantly shaped by genetic inheritance. Now again, there's lots of things that lie beneath that sentence, but that's the basic claim of genetic penetrance. The opposite side of that continuum is what I'm terming environmental determinism. This also, the quote comes from an interview: why are you defining yourself in racial groups that are less than 1%, perhaps less than 0.1% of your total genetic inheritance? Dividing ourselves into racial groups is not biologically sound. There is no such thing as race. Race is a social construction. Environment is what matters. Environment broadly defined as sort of social context, history, culture, a variety of things. That is, in short, most phenotypes are caused or profoundly shaped by responses to societal forces. Now, somebody will quickly point out that epigenetics somewhere sits in the middle of these two things, and I think that's correct, and I'm going to ignore that because I'm trying to set up a sort of a simple continuum, which is complicated enough, but we'll need to come back to that too. Okay, so that's one dimension, is genetics to environment, roughly speaking. The other dimension is technology optimism to pessimism. So here's the optimism quote: appreciating that genetic differences exist from one individual to the next will diminish the extent to which people have biologically driven biases across groups. It will help us to understand the human condition. A slightly more formal description comes in the second quote. This is from an article about genetic optimism, technology optimism. They're centered on advancement concern driven by motivations for attaining growth, supports strategies for seeking gains, even at the risk of errors or loss. So type 1 versus type 2 error, risk-seeking versus risk aversion, optimism versus pessimism. It's a whole series of terms that's sort of trying to capture this distinction. Pessimism is, roughly speaking, the opposite of optimism. Again, I did open-ended surveys, so this is sort of like an interview. It's not, the methodology behind it is slightly different, but roughly speaking, it's the same sort of thing. Genomics exacerbates inequities in knowledge production practices. Who gets asked to be the inquirers? Which people are asked to offer up their bodies as raw materials for scientific research that has little likelihood of benefiting? This is an exploitative science in which people like those of us in this room benefit, and people whose material we're using to do the science or to do the politics are basically harmed, or at least not benefiting. The slightly more formal statement: pessimist is centered on security concerns, supports strategies of protecting against possible losses, even at the risk of missing gains. So, in short, the opposite of the technology optimist. All right, so we have two dimensions for how do you put them together. Basically a classic 2x2 table. So technology, optimism, and pessimism on the in the columns, genetic penetrance and determination, environmental determinism on the rows. And so my insertion of the very simple political starting point is that one is sort of the property of the right and one cell is property of the left, and the other two are complicated. I'm going to complicate this, but this is sort of the starting premise, so you want to keep this in the back of your mind. Okay, the evidence comes from a survey that my co-author and I did. I will not bore you with the details of that. It was an online survey in 2011, about 20 minutes. We stratified the sample by conventionally defined race, ethnicity, as people define themselves. It's got about 4,200 people. So there's lots of people of lots of different of the sort of four conventional groups. Here's the question that we're spending a lot of time worrying about. One of the two questions. This is the question about sort of genetic penetrance versus environmental determinism. And it's an awkward question. I think if we spent a lot of time trying to write it, it's very difficult to get at this concept in a public opinion survey. To our knowledge, nobody else has tried to do it. Surveys are supposed to be written at a level of sort of 7th or 8th grade literacy, so the language can't be the language that would be more readily used among us. So in any case, you can read it. I won't bother to read it to you out loud. Some things about, well, I will actually, about a person are genetically connected to their race or ethnicity. What does that mean? Something about it. Other things may be due to their environment or the way they live. How much does each of the following have to do with a person's race or ethnicity compared to the environment or lifestyle? And again, sort of real scientists wince at this question, but trust me, we spent a lot of time pre-testing and trying a lot of different wording. So we offered them then 8 things, which are ordered here. These were ordered in random order in the survey itself, but they range here from things that typically we would expect people to see as genetically, have a strong genetic link to possibly, at least a strong genetic link individually and possibly in conventional understanding to race or ethnicity, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, eye color, down to the flu, which scientists actually now saying there is a genetic link to it, but at least when we wrote the survey, people didn't believe there was, or at least we didn't believe there was. And then these 4 things in the middle, kind of intelligence, heart disease, sexual orientation, aggressiveness, which of course are much more socially, ethically, politically fraught, even than the others. And we gave them three response categories. Basically environment, mixture, which is kind of your who knows what's going on, kind of middle category, or race and ethnicity. We have 8 items, we have 3 responses, we summed them, we took an average. So all you need to know about the background of this is that the higher the number between 1 and 3, the more likely they are to say that whatever it was that we asked about, these 8 categories, has a genetic inheritance component. It's more prevalent in one, quote, racial or ethnic group than in another due to genetic factors of inheritance. So. All right, now we get to the results, and I'm going to show you 3 slides that are all identical, except with a little bit of emphasis. So the first one is simply all, which is the full sample, about 4,200 people. They're weighted to be representative of the national population. So the closest we can come saying this is what all Americans would say if asked. And the mean is 1.98. It's basically 2 out of a 3, which means that everybody chose the middle, roughly speaking. I mean, the simplest way of saying it is you offered genetics, mixture, environment. Number 2 is the mixture, and that's where everybody came down. Not terribly. That's actually not right if you dig into the data, but the average across the whole sample, across all 8 categories, is the middle. Is there a partisan valence to this? The answer is no. 1.98 for Democrats, 1.99 for Republicans. Essentially, I mean, it's close to identical across the 2 parties as you can get. Is there a racial or ethnic component to it? A little bit, but not very much. Whites were slightly more likely to say that these various phenotypes are more prevalent in one group or another due to genetic factors. Our language for it is connected to race or ethnicity. Blacks were slightly less likely to say so, but these are not huge differences. Okay, so that's the first dimension. Hang on to those in your mind, and I'm going to now want to talk through the optimism, pessimism side, the columns of that original typology. Our question was, will each of these 4 things do more harm than good to society, equal amounts of harm and good, more good than harm? And this is a fairly standard set of response categories. The things we asked about had not been asked about very much. So basically, with certain inherited diseases that have a racial or group inflection, genetic tests that are kind of individually focused, medical or scientific research, and the fourth is law enforcement. Those are kind of the four categories that we ask people about. Again, we did a sum, blah, 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 blah. The higher the value between 1 and 3, the more optimistic people are. That's the central thing. Okay, so if you look at the full sample, which is representative of the full population, people are pretty optimistic. On a scale from 1 to 3, they're at 2.3. So they're not just coming down in the middle saying, well, equal amounts of good and harm. I don't really know how to answer this question. They're more, they push themselves somewhat more in the optimistic direction. What about partisanship? Democrats are a little bit more optimistic than the Republicans. Again, not a huge difference, but at least a visible difference. I don't know why my Asian American, I can't figure out what's going on with the slide, but there's no meaning to the fact that the Asian Americans are slightly higher on the slide. It's just screw up in the technology. Basically, whites and Asian Americans are slightly more optimistic than African Americans and Latinos. So you can see a difference there, but it's not a dramatically huge difference. So these are surprising results. And I want to pause for a minute because this is where the politics now comes in. I've kind of walked you through the data. The conventional wisdom is the Republicans are technology pessimists or even anti-science. The examples that everybody typically uses are climate change. Republicans don't believe it's occurring or don't believe that there's any human intervention that's causing it or don't believe that science or human can do anything about it. Republicans are conventionally disagree with the idea of genetic or human evolution. Much higher proportion are likely to say that humans or all life was created by a deity at some identifiable point in the past. Republicans are much more opposed, or at least were when this was a salient political issue, to stem cell research, fetal stem cell research, than Democrats were. So many big scientific issues have been politicized, typically in the last decade. They weren't necessarily always so. And the conventional wisdom is the Democrats are pro-science and Republicans are anti-science, at least in these very big visible arenas. There's a theoretical reason behind this claim. And it comes from, my favorite version of it comes from Albert Hirschman. Basically, everything that's, almost anything that I quote tends to come from Albert Hirschman, who was a genius. And he wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Reaction, published in 1991, so it's fairly old. The idea, his argument is that conservatives, he basically means political conservatives here, are very worried about innovation. They're technology pessimists, to use my earlier language, for three reasons. One is that the innovations in public policy or science or other aspects of life are going to be futile. Human nature is what it is, society is what it is, tradition is very important, so the proposed change isn't actually going to have much impact. Or, actually he says and, conservatives are much more worried that varieties of innovations are going to jeopardize good things that already exist, so that to the degree that society or humans or interpersonal relations are actually pretty effective, the innovation is going to cause trouble rather than benefit. And the third argument is that conservatives are more likely than liberal to believe that innovations will have perverse effects, unintended consequences. So on balance, one would expect, both for these theoretical arguments and if you look at other kinds of scientific arenas, so conservatives to be on the pessimistic side. If you look at the other dimension, the genetic determinant or genetic penetrance versus environmental determinism, again, the conventional wisdom is that the left are social constructionists and the right are more likely to believe that there is some genetic or biological or real component to notions of race, that diseases are not created by society, that there are genetic or biological or perhaps lifestyle individual choices, but they're not environmental and social. Again, there's a kind of a theory behind that, but I won't. The point here is that genomics doesn't work that way. Genomics is a very big and very important science that is not following the conventional wisdom either about Republicans and Democrats or about sort of African Americans versus the rest of the population or the left versus right on either of my two dimensions. So here's a slightly abstracted way of showing the same thing. Again, this is the original typology that I had. These are the four cells. I said the top left was going to be the right. My language here is hopelessly complicated. Cell number 1 on the top left was going to be the right. Cell number 4 was going to be the left. All right. Just let me explain what's going on in this thing rather than try to use my language because I've got left and right hopelessly conflated here. So basically, again, we're not worrying about the details of the methodology unless you want to come back to this later. The plurality of all respondents are in cell 2. That's this top right. So I don't think there's a pointer on here. Which is to say, they are both relatively high on the idea of inheritance, genetic inheritance through race and ethnicity, to use our survey language, and they tend to be technology optimists. That combination is more prominent in the population than any other of the 3 other possible combinations. The bottom of the slide gives a slightly more formal definition. The greater the number of phenotypes that the respondent thinks are disproportionately present in one group, i.e. group inflected genetics, the more likely that person is to be optimistic about the societal benefits. That's kind of the crucial point. That's probably not what I would have predicted, I would guess. It's certainly not what Maya and I predicted. So that's true for the population as a whole. This is the same kind of analysis for partisanship. And it works the same way. It's not surprising that because if you have the population as a whole, the population is comprised of Republicans and Democrats, so not surprising we have roughly the same result. But again, I want to emphasize the 2 things. One is that people who are both Republicans and Democrats, there's no difference between the parties, who are genetic determinists, who are more likely to say the phenotype appears in a particular group disproportionately because of genetic factors, also are technology optimists and more likely to say that genomics is beneficial or is likely to be beneficial than harmful to society. No difference between the 2 parties. Similarly, let's go through the exact same analysis and you look at it in racial or ethnic terms. There's essentially no difference between blacks or Latinos on the one hand and whites on the other. Asian Americans don't quite fall into the cell 2 that I've just described as frequently, but roughly speaking, even that's not statistically significant, roughly speaking, the big takeaway here is that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, and there's not much of a difference between racial and ethnic groups. Again, people who are more likely to say there's a genetic explanation for these 8 factors that I talked about earlier are also more likely to be optimistic about the role of genomic science in society. So, for a genomicist, this might not be terribly surprising. Of course, I mean, you know, genomic science is going to do benefits for society, and to the degree that people have genetic inheritance, genomics is going to be more beneficial. From a political scientist perspective, given what I just said about Republicans and Democrats and this pro and anti-science, or about social constructionists versus genetic determinists, these are surprising results. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about how to make sense of this overall pattern of results. And again, I could go back and talk about the results themselves if that's important, because I was kind of marching through a lot of material fairly quickly. But I want to kind of get to the so what piece of it, which is frankly more interesting. So the first thing to say is that Americans are pretty, our respondents were pretty good on balance at answering these rather difficult questions. Only about 2% of them said the flu was genetically determined through race. And you might ask why even that 2% thought that, but you never get something like 2% in a survey. I mean, this is a very low number. People basically, the way we constructed the question, and given what was known about the flu in 2011, this is the right answer. 40 to 80% got, roughly speaking, the right answer at the level of sort of survey research with regard to the 3 phenotypes that are most likely, most plausibly understood as being inherited disproportionately in one group rather than another due to genetic factors. 40% is a little bit low, but these are hard questions. Many people don't know what cystic fibrosis is. Many whites don't know what sickle cell anemia. People got eye color pretty well, so those are pretty good answers. The other 4 phenotypes, which are of course the most socially controversial, does intelligence have a genetic component? Does heart disease have a genetic component? That doesn't quite have the social sensitivity, but it's complicated. Does a tendency toward aggression or violence have a genetic component? Is sexual orientation have a genetic component? Again, this question is about connected with your race or ethnicity. So it's even more sensitive than just the basic question itself. Do you think that somehow sexual orientation is disproportionately present in one group, one racial or ethnic group, compared with another due to genetic factors, that's a really tough question. And not surprisingly, not very many people said yes to that. So on balance, I think these answers kind of make sense. They were pretty much the same pattern across both political parties, across all 4 racial and ethnic groups, so you didn't see big racial differences. People with higher education tended to get the correct answer, again, as understood kind of at this relatively general level, a little bit more than people with less education, but not dramatically more. On balance, this was a sort of a reassuring set of results if you think that what reassuring means that the American population kind of gets basic contours of how to think about genetics through questions of racial and ethics. So I'm not here to say this is not an alarmist argument yet. Now I'm going to get to the alarmist piece of it. Why does this matter? So I want to back up and say, why does this matter? Remind us why this somewhat arcane little piece of research could have huge social and political consequences. I wanted to show the YouTube video, but I always worry that technology is not going to work, so I'm just doing this in sort of flat screens. But I would urge you to go find this on YouTube. It's a very funny little segment, or a very alarming little segment, depending on how you think about it. So the George Lopez show, the burning question, of course, it's very dramatically, drum roll, et cetera, who is blacker? So he says, Charles Barkley had a DNA test that showed him to be of 75% African descent. And there's, of course, no discussion here about whether the DNA tests are accurate, whether the language of race or ethnicity is real. So he's 75% African, as a stated fact, okay? They go through a whole long song and dance, and it turns out that Snoop Dogg is 71% of African descent. So therefore, he is less black than Charles Barkley, right? That's what the show is telling us. Snoop Dogg, of course, laughs hilariously and says, oh, no, we got to have a revote. This ain't right. So he's not happy about this. Now, again, it's sort of a joke, but it's not quite a joke. I don't know if you can see this clearly enough. And then there's a video image of Charles Barkley, who's got a crown and ermine robe. And he says, I'll just call you Whitey from now on. And then there's a whole series of gifts given to Snoop Dogg of the kinds of things that white people like. So they give him a pair of plaid Bermuda shorts, and they give him a video of Glee. And so they're all laughing, they're kind of joking. But the difference between being 71% black and 75% black is the premise of this little joke. So the notion of kind of racial inheritance through genetics, or racial self-definition or other definition through genetic inheritance, has some deep roots in it. Let's just leave it at that. So that's just to remind you why I'm going through this whole exercise. Now, I'm not doing racial ancestry, but again, the notion of kind of racially inflected genetic inheritance is one that I think has a lot of resonance, both for good and for ill. So my concluding questions are, on the one hand, the plurality in cell tune. That means the people who are most likely to think that there is a genetic component to these various phenotypes that works its way through race and ethnicity, are also the most technology optimistic about the role of genomics in society. That's what cell2 means. My shorthand is cell2. So one argument there is that this is really scary. People think race and ethnicity are real. They think it has genetic components. They think that the genetic components of race and ethnicity matter for the way you present yourself in the world, as for diseases. Right? This ought to have echoes from eugenics and 19th century racial science. And they're optimistic about genomics, about what genomics is going to do in that arena. Okay. So one logic is that this really is the reinvention. Remember my quote at the very beginning about the long tail of genomics is eugenics. One response to the survey data that I showed you is that there's something in that anxiety that we need to really, really worry about. So again, a slightly more formal way of putting it, this is a quote from an introductory essay, or a set of essays in the Annals of American Academy of Social and Political Science. Sociobiological perspectives place inordinate attention on genetic factors that influence a person's choice and position in society. This attention to genetic factors reifies social constructs such as race, justifies hierarchy and inequality. So there's an anxiety out there that thinking things are genetically inherited through race and thinking genomics is beneficial to society is going to have this impact of reifying social constructs such as race, justifying hierarchy and inequality. If that's true, if that's how we interpret these data, or the more broad framing around race is real and is genetically inherited. Then there's a big educational process that we experts, those of us who know the history, who understand the science, or at least who understand the political implications, have to educate the American public. The public is wrong, and this is a real problem. So there's a bunch of educational tasks if that interpretation is right. Genetic determinism doesn't take sufficiently into account historical and contextual explanations. Race and ethnicity are social constructs, they aren't real. Hierarchies and phenotypes are learned. They can be unlearned because they're all socially constructed. Diseases like sickle cell anemia are not racially inherited. They affect people from particularly geographic regions, for example, around the Mediterranean, many of whom are not conventionally understood blacks. And most generally, science can be used, and too often is used, to reinforce injustice and hierarchy. This is dangerous stuff. And we need to teach people that it's dangerous stuff, regardless of what the scientists themselves think they're doing. They don't think they're doing that. But that's how it gets used in society. There's a reverse, an opposite interpretation of the same set of results, which is that the set of people in cell 2, the people who think there is a racial component to genetic inheritance and who are optimistic about genomics, that's what I mean by cell 2, this is actually a good thing. That's the sort of the flip interpretation. People are able to make distinctions. There can be group-inflected allele frequencies, but those don't necessarily have to unzip all the way back to eugenics and 19th century racial science. And again, the short evidence for this is, again, a quotation from an interview that I didn't do, I wish I had, because it's a wonderful book. Catherine Bliss published a book on her genomicists are talking about race-positive genomics. And they are, and as she describes them, or as they describe themselves, they believe in the strategic use of a biologically essentialist definition of race. Refusing to recognize biological processes involved with race is the same thing, or tantamount to scientific racism. So just as there's a political perception that we should not be colorblind, because it leads us to ignore real racial hierarchies and racial injustices, similarly, we should not be colorblind in genomics because that will lead us to ignore real genetic differences that disproportionately affect one group or another and that will have serious medical or social consequences. So race blindness is the problem in this view, not too much attention to race as a genetic. If that's the case, if that view number 2 is correct, then there's an educational task for the left, which is quite different. It's not teaching people that science can promote hierarchy and justice, teaching people that race is only a social construct, and so on. It's a different task. And I revert to Albert Hirschman, as I so often do. And his description, remember I talked about how conservatives fear innovation for the reasons he talked about. He flips that around to say, at least in sort of a simple argument, progressives focus on why new and old reforms will interact positively. They perceive the dangers of inaction rather than action, i.e. progressives are technology optimists. He wrote this in 1991. But that's no longer the case for many people on the left when they think about genomics or think about genomics and race. And so again, here's the fear. Here's the fear. There are dangers that have to do with genetic stigmatization of subgroups. If we attach a good-bad cut to genetic differences, and inevitably we will, that may be the crucial phrase in this long quote, if these correlate with what we understand to be racial groups, the problems will be huge. So the learning task in this second view is that the left should stop sounding like Branscombe and start sounding more like Hirschman's view. That this is not really all that scary. We can, as a society, we have moved past the eugenics era. We have moved past the 19th century racial science. We are capable as a society of thinking about allele frequency differences in socially defined groups or genetically defined groups without unzipping all the way back to eugenics. And we progressives should celebrate this new science and celebrate the fact that Americans have genuinely changed rather than being fearful about reversion. So here I conclude, do we trust the scientists? Do we trust political elites? Do we trust ordinary Americans enough not to freak out by the use of genomics or genetics and race in the same sentence? The answer is I have no idea. I really remain deeply agnostic on this. If I look at some aspects of change in the American racial system, I'm optimistic. If I look at other aspects of non-change in the American racial system, I'm deeply pessimistic. So I stop there. I'm remaining entirely on the fence. Thank you. That was a lot of stuff to go through fairly quickly, so I'm happy to go back or go in some other direction as you wish.
I have a question, yeah. Will you describe for us the methodology in terms of environment? That includes climatic conditions as well as social, cultural, and religious affiliations. And the second part is, if you had not just included Republicans and Democrats, but those who were independents and other memberships, you believe the result would have varied?
Yeah, very excellent questions. Environment, I mean here, sort of roughly speaking, everything that isn't genetics and everything that is, in some sense, humanly created. So it isn't genetics and it isn't fate or God's law or serendipity or something like that. So it ranges from literal environment, physical location, climate, how close you live to a pollution-emitting factory, all through things like your social economic class, the way you're treated in society, your family background. So environment is a hodgepodge category that's sort of not genetics. That's mostly what I mean here. Now clearly, the next round of this work needs to think much more systematically about what people mean when they say not genetics. And I actually have a proposal I'm very proud to report that I'm one of the only 2 social scientists who's an associate member of the Broad Institute, which is this huge Genomic Science center. So I'm trying to get them to pay for a survey that will dig much more deeply into the question of what do people mean when they say not genetics. Do they mean literal environment? Do they mean sort of family background? Do they mean free choice? Do they mean God's law? Do they mean something else? So at the moment, it's a catch-all. In terms of adding the independence, and yes, if you thought this was complicated, the earlier version of this had a lot more data in it. The independents in our survey are a very odd bunch. There aren't very many of them. There's only a few hundred of them. They tend to be very poorly educated, and they screw up they're very different from either Republicans or Democrats in a lot of somewhat inconsistent ways. And I think that's just a flaw of the survey. I think that we have what people who call themselves independents in our survey tend to be people who are not very connected to education or to I don't know what. I mean, it's just, they don't help make any sense of this. They complicate the story, and our excuse for leaving them out is that there's very few, and we don't know who they are. We can't figure them out. So it's not a very good answer, but it's a methodological rather than a substantive answer.
I would think that, one conclusion from this is that race is complicated, and that anything you can do to get people thinking and talking about race is a useful thing. I can also imagine, because you use the terminology of race or ethnic rather than versus genetic, that is, if I think about how would I have answered some of those questions, to me there's a big difference between saying there is a genetic basis for something versus there is a racial or ethnic basis. Because for me, ethnicity or race, if you use race, it is more of a cultural difference. And so I can imagine both a positive view and a negative view of things like heart disease. Well, you have a genetic preponderance for it, or is it because in your culture you aren't eating right? You're blaming the person, but that is part of. Is that all part of the racial identity of the race as well?
Yeah, you're right. And again, we kind of fudge over this much more. Our phrase is genetically connected to their race or ethnicity.
Yeah.
So we're trying to invoke the idea that there is a genetic inheritance.
Right.
And the other side, with it due to their environment or the way they live, is trying to invoke the idea that because you're black, you might live in an environment where you have no grocery stores and you have only access to fast food, and so therefore, so the effort here is to pull those different understandings of racial inheritance in a literal genetic sense from racial inheritance in a social, economic, cultural, lifestyle sense. Did people get it? You know, hard to know. This is a hard question.
Well, it looks like they did, since you're...
I mean, I'm reassured, and I showed you the slide that says the answers make sense. That people kind of, I mean, they didn't say the same thing about the flu that they said about sickle cell. And blacks and whites basically said, and Latinos and Asians basically said sort of the same thing as the other group, so there's not a huge, whites say everything is because you're black, and blacks say nothing is because you're black. I mean, that didn't happen. Yeah. The question is, should we get people talking about race? Yes, I think the answer is clearly, well, there's two answers. One is Americans are obsessed by race, right? I mean, including me. I mean, I spent my academic career studying. We talk a lot about race. Whether we talk about it in ways we collectively somehow that enable us to think through where it does and doesn't matter to the individual themselves, to the environment, or whether it becomes a stand-in for a whole lot of other things that we're really worried about. It's hard. I mean, you got a country with 330 million people, you're going to get a few good conversations and probably a lot that aren't very good. So.
Could you clarify
I'm working my way
said
down.
about sickle cell anemia in terms of being, did you say it was environmentally connected?
No, it's I mean, again, I'm not the real scientist here, but my understanding is that sickle cell, also cystic fibrosis, a variety of diseases that are disproportionately present in one conventionally defined racial group more than in others. Again, all kinds of fuzzy language here. That it's predominantly a geographically defined disease rather than a racial disease, in the sense that people who live around the Mediterranean area, broadly defined, are genetically more likely to get sickle cell than people who live in Japan or Alaska or whatever. So it is a genetically inherited disease. I don't think there's any dispute about that. It is disproportionately appears in Africans, but it is not genetically inherited because you are African or African American. That's what I was trying to say. And again, scientists in the room can correct me if I have that wrong, but that's my understanding, roughly speaking. Yeah.
Did you ask the respondents whether they were male or female, and do you have any data on the responses in those cases?
Yeah, this survey population, they're basically, I mean, well, without worrying about this, the answer is yes. We do have a lot of demographic data on them. We looked at gender differences, and I'm not remembering. I could dig them out. I think there wasn't very much. I mean, the big thing that jumps out, either people didn't get the question, so they kind of just mushed toward the middle. There wasn't very much. There were education differences, and there were differences in terms of, we had a couple questions about scientific literacy. How, does DNA appear in every cell, or only sperm and egg, or egg, so we had 3 questions like that. The people who were high on scientific literacy were a little more likely to say that things like sickle cell, cystic fibrosis, eye color were genetically inherited, but not much more likely to say that with regard to race and ethnicity. So they were kind of a little more right. Not hugely so, and my memory is that there were no big gender differences. But I get in touch with you later and I'll check. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I now understand why I started as a Republican and am now a Democrat.
Sorry, on which side of this issue are you?
I want to follow on Dr. Wright's point, though, because he made a good one, and that is that sickle cell anemia is the first disease that was discovered that had a genetic or biological basis with one change in one amino acid. It was stunning, that discovery. But if we understand why, it's because it protects those populations from malaria.
Right.
So they don't die. So if we understood the why, and we don't in every case, of these genetic differences, we can appreciate the magnificent variety and the benefit that proposed for those populations. Now we don't have to worry so much about malaria and sickle cell anemia as a fatal disease. We have to deal with it in a different way. But the history of that is important.
Yeah.
I make the assumption that the science behind here is a fact, and we cannot change that. And if we can do it and study it, we will. But the context in which we understand that is very important. And if you take a look, if anybody who's taken Professor Meyer's course in the Supreme Court, we can see where an African American starts out as 3/5 of a person, and then through Plessy Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education now becomes something quite different from this. The same is true for women with the vote. So a lot of this is going to have to lie with the courts. They're going to have to be informed on this, and I'm an optimist. Thank you.
So I just want to pick up on one sentence. I make the assumption that the science behind this is a fact. Scientists will say that. One of my favorite interview subjects who's actually become something of a friend is, her comment is, I like data. Data are true. I like true data. Same thing. There is a set of social scientists who don't buy that claim. Right? Science is as much socially constructed. This is not particularly my view, so I'm not necessarily going to articulate it as clearly as somebody might who holds this view. Science is as much socially constructed as anything else is. I mean, this podium is real. It's not a claim that there were, it's purely noumenal and not, but the idea, the categories within which we study, the tools that we use, the concepts that we believe to be important to pursue scientifically rather than other concepts, are themselves deeply socially invented. So it's not that what you find in the lab isn't true, but you know to look for it, and you find it, and you identify it, and you study it only because of a huge societal kind of context in the background. And there are, I think, people who will go far enough to say that what you said is just not a correct statement. It's not my view, or it's correct only in a very narrow sense. So I think part of what this whole project is trying to do is not adjudicate that. I'll never be able to adjudicate it, but to kind of get a sense of what the public, do you trust? So I have a whole series of questions about trusting science. What do you, a whole series of questions about, so here's a set of statements, which ones do you think are correct or not? Trying to get a feel for whether the public in general is more like the scientists or more like the kind of sociology of science people I was just describing. And the answer is that they're a little bit more like the scientists, but not a whole lot more. They trust in science has gone down too. So there's a whole second interesting conversation there. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you envision, or is there already existing something, not exactly a genomics for dummies, but genomics for people who, some of the basic things that you find to be real based on evidence of research that people can understand, that would help them to be less biased in their views of people who are different from themselves?
Yeah, there are a lot of efforts to do that, as you would expect. There are online courses, there are, the teaching company videos. I mean, there's a whole series of kind of pretty high quality, probably also some low quality, public education efforts. There is, I think, a commitment in state boards of education to increase either biology in general or the teaching of genetics in biology classes. It runs up against the politics of evolution, of course. Because the effort to teach more biology, and particularly to teach more genetics in biology, leads you into the direction that if you talk about genetics, you pretty much got to talk about evolution, and if you talk about evolution, you're pretty much going to move in the direction of human evolution, which is going to, so there's a fair amount of anxiety in the political arena. Are you okay?
Yeah.
About how to kind of address this. But it is the case, I think, that schools, colleges, certainly medical schools, the profession of genetic counseling is, I think, more robust than it used to be, although my understanding is that many too few people, from their perspective at least, are becoming genetic counselors. There's very little, you don't hear, I said this about elected officials a while ago, but I think it's a more general point. There aren't very many kind of publicly visible, prominent elites, whether political or other, who kind of talk about genomics. It's a hard subject, it's hard scientifically, and it's so fraught. So people who are most likely to have the public ear either just don't get it because it's hard. I mean, there's a reason they don't, the next generation is going to be a lot better at it than our generation is. But also because it's very different, so I have these complicated sentences that say, sometimes I say group-inflected inheritance, but sometimes I'm careful to say a phenotype that is more likely to appear in one group than another due to some combination of genetic factors, and oh, by the way, there's epigenetics also, right? I mean, so my sort of reasonably more correct sentence is impossible. So you get George Lopez, right? I mean, you get you're 75% this and you're 71% that, and therefore there's a meeting. They're all joking. They knew this was goofy. They were laughing. But there it is on national television, right? So I think the education mission, I think lots of people are committed to it. It's very hard to do it well. And the people who are probably most likely to be influential tend not to want to touch it. It's just too hard. Too hard socially. Let me just get a couple of other people who haven't had a chance to. Yeah. Yes, please.
So I actually have been in the medical field and worked in molecular biology when it was a fairly new field. And one of the things that horrified me was that as we were able to map out a section of the genome, my job was to take all of this paperwork to the lawyer.
Right.
Patent it. And then you have the whole Henrietta Lacks fiasco about how somehow people can have proprietary rights.
Do people know what the Henrietta Lacks fiasco is? Do you want to give us one sentence?
Henrietta Lacks was a poor black woman whose cells became enormously important to the research around cancer and cell biology. Her cells were taken without her family's permission. It was proprietized, and people made a lot of money while the family still lived in poverty. So that idea of Jim Crow and keeping people is real. So as I listen to you, my concern is that there should be a political discussion about what does the human genome mean to society. And I know that Geisinger is starting this whole genomics. It is flourishing in the medical industrial complex that we still as a society haven't figured out that healthcare is a basic right.
Yes. I mean, patenting is a big issue. It's obviously a very complicated legal as well as technical as well as ethical issue. The pharmaceutical companies will say that we're not going to get the kind of genetically based medicines we need absent patenting because the economics of it just aren't going to work. And they're probably right. I mean, I can't see, it's not like the federal government is going to leap in with billions of dollars of, medical tests. I mean, so maybe the pharma is right in at least given the economic context within which this all, but, right? Certainly, but. And as we were talking this morning, I mean, there are huge ethical issues, particularly, I mean, I've been talking about the racial arena, but actually in some ways maybe the bigger issues are in the medical arena, right? What do you reveal to people if you have genomic testing about their future? How do you think about consent? How do you think about either the rights or the responsibilities of family members? I mean, one of the questions I've asked my undergraduates is, I'm engaged to you, we're going to be married, we're both 23. I get a testing in which determines, again, scare quotes here around determines, that I'm going to get Alzheimer's when I'm 47. Does my fiance have a right to that information? Well, no, according to conventional, medical information is private. But, it's going to change his life. Do identical twins have the right to the medical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge set of issues just within medicine.
Which is political.
Oh, you won't get any argument from me. I mean, all of this is political as far as I'm concerned. But that's the lens that I look at. Probably a couple more questions.
Two more.
Yes, certainly back.
Do you have your hand up?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Yes,
Please.
If you bear with me just for a couple of minutes, I did enjoy very much your presentation, right on target, and so I would be speaking from a racism level. And I certainly agree with what you said about the need to talk. Indeed, we do need to talk. I'm certain, and I can use a very quick example. I'm sure there are a couple of people in this room right now who probably said to themselves and to others, did you see that person there, that black man? He has his hat on. He didn't have sense enough to take off his hat. And the reason I'm wearing a hat today is because my head gets cold. I have hair no more. I think we need to talk. I heard just in the last week two disturbing things, which I addressed, and I think we say that we feel that we want to do away or level off some of this racism, but then we don't address it. Just in the last couple of weeks, I was somewhere or other, and someone talked about Jewing someone down. You've heard that expression, I'm sure? Yes, I'm sure you have. I addressed it, in a civil way, of course. Did you hear what you said, Jewing someone down? And before that, I'm an artist in a lot of ways, music particularly. Well, I don't know that that's important, maybe just kind of skip that. But I've talked about in the so-called black community, eye contact and lack of eye contact. Very often people of color are criticized for that. You didn't look me in the eye. Or they don't look in the eye. They're this, they're that, the other thing, which is ridiculous. And I can give you an argument why that is, but I won't go into that. The other thing is I heard someone say in a public meeting, speak of walking behind some people, particularly of color, and they were speaking in such a way that they couldn't be understood. They were saying things like axe. Well, I addressed that too, and I won't get into that either. But if you know the background of that whole thing, then you may change your whole opinion about it. So I do think we need to talk. This other debacle that you all remember with, and darn it, he has the same name I have, Donald, no, not Trump, Sterling. Donald Sterling. Remember that whole debacle with the, what was it, a basketball team or football team or whatever? I told people I was happy that that happened. And they looked at me peculiarly, of course, and I was happy because it uncovered a whole other level of racism that I've dealt with all my life. You know, the business of, oh, it's okay if you're in a closed situation and there are people of varying ethnic groups there, but don't be seen outside with them. Don't you dare be seen with them. Stay away from them. And it's a whole other level of racism that I dare say most of you aren't aware of it or have never talked about it. And so indeed, we need to talk about it. Moving outside, outside of our comfort levels. And I say that for many ethnic groups. After I leave here, I'm going to, I think it's the Russian or Greek-Russian Catholic Church, I'm not sure. But anyway, they make pierogies. And I'm going to pick up some pierogies today. They will see a person of color there who knows about pierogies, but these are homemade. And I think that's true for other groups getting into something that they don't know about. Go to this festival, go to this picnic or whatever, and that way we do begin to learn about each other. But I'd say we could start with something very simply. All of us sitting here right now could clean up our language. When you hear something that is wrong, address it. That's all.
Thank you. I'm going to have to end this because our speaker has to make an airplane. And I know that there are lots more questions. And I'd hate to turn down my husband, but I think that we have to, say thank you very much for this enlightening, disturbing, stimulating conversation that we hope to continue at another time.
Thank you.